We are certain that the time is now to reach out to one another as two peoples who are no longer enemies or rivals, but neighbors. Time to unfurl our flags, raise them up, and let the world know that we wish each other well.
Secretary of State John Kerry hails a new era in U.S.-Cuba relations as Old Glory goes up at the U.S. Embassy in Havana.
Old wounds open, anger and disgust from Cuban-American exiles. A member of Congress who represents them joins us live.
Uber on the comeback in Broward. The ride-sharing service gets some support from the county commission. We will take that to the roundtable.
Good morning. Welcome aboard. So glad you could join us for a packed hour ahead. And we begin with the raising of the American flag.
It happened in Havana on Friday. The Stars and Stripes being hoisted aloft at the U.S. Embassy for the first time in 54 years. Secretary of State John Kerry called it a new beginning in an old and fractured relationship between Washington and Havana, two bitter antagonists for more than half a century. The two sides are going to begin talks in mid-September. A leading opponent in Congress of the President's Cuba Initiative is Representative Ileana Ros-Lehtinen of Miami. She is a Republican who serves the 27th Congressional District. We are so glad to welcome you this morning.
Thank you so much to both.
Sunday morning.
It's a pleasure.
All right, Congresswoman, here's the obvious question. We'll get to the embassy specifically in a minute, but for 10 presidents, half a century or more, the United States has had a policy of trying to isolate Cuba and embargo, trying to bring down the Castros. It didn't work. President Obama said, let's try something new. Let's engage. What's wrong with engagement?
Well, that would have been a natural segue when Kerry said those words to then say, and Cuba has had only two so-called presidents in that same time. What a missed opportunity for Kerry. He could have said, he could have pulled a Ronald Reagan when Reagan said to Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Kerry could have said, Mr. Castro, have an election, free the political prisoners, but he didn't. And I know that it's interesting to say.
He did say the United States, our core principles are a democratically elected government, and Cubans deserve to have a democratically elected leadership.
But the only true policy statement that he made in that speech was when he called for the United States Congress to lift the embargo. He didn't call for Castro to have elections. He said, gee, wouldn't it be swell if? But the only specific ask was Congress lift the embargo, which we're not going to do. And Michael, to your point, I know that it sounds like a good idea. We've tried this, it hasn't worked. Let's try B. Well, the first is that Cuba is not an experiment for the United States to say, hey, we tried this, let's change the formula around. The reality is the entire world has been wheeling and dealing and doing tourism in Cuba, and that hasn't changed either. And in no instance has commercial engagement been the leading factor of changing a regime. We wish that it would. If we flood them with McDonald's, they will have democracies. It's not going to happen that way.
Well, what happened on Friday was so much symbolism, and now really it's Congress's turn to implement whatever policies come next, or don't. So in
Not
Congress,
really, Glenna, because it's now all of this symbolism took place. Now it's Cuba's turn to turn the page. Cuba's turn to lift their embargo on the Cuban people. You know, it's not just symbolism that not a single dissident was invited to that ceremony. That speaks volumes to the Cuban regime. And this is the 18th consecutive Sunday of beating of the ladies in white. As we speak, live on Sunday morning, the ladies in white are being beaten and arrested.
All right, but to your point, the symbolism of the flag going up and the certain changes that have taken place, there was a very clear message that nothing else is going to happen until the U.S. takes the embargo away from the Cubans. And there's a very clear message on the U.S. side, nothing's going to happen with the embargo until human rights is addressed in Cuba. So
not really, because John Kerry is falling for the Castro line, and shame on him for doing so. Gee, if we only do this, then Cuba will have changes. We are holding Cuba back from having elections. The embargo prevents Cuban elections? No. The embargo prevents them from having multi-party? No. The embargo prevents them from having a free press? Let's have changes in Cuba. We could lift the embargo tomorrow. Nothing in Cuba will change because the regime is not about to change. And in fact, Josefina Vidal, the leading negotiator for the Cubans, said last night, what did she say? Cuba is not going to change 1 millimeter to suit the U.S.
I have to say that there are some Cuba experts whom I respect who say that statements like Josefina Vidal's or these claims or demands from Bruno Rodriguez, the foreign minister, give back Gitmo, give us $5 billion, are really for the hardliners within the Cuban government.
Yes, that's like saying
really
that Iranian state-sponsored march in Tehran saying death to America, death to Israel. Oh, those are just the hardliners. These are the official folks speaking for the Castro regime and speaking for the regime in Iran. If you fall for that line, it's just for public consumption, then why don't you take them seriously? You know, sometimes when people tell you they're going to kill you,
they mean it.
They mean it.
Mm-hmm. So practically speaking, there are already bills filed in Congress, one to lift travel restrictions, all of them permanently, one to take away parts of the embargo. So you go back to Congress and the split this time really is more geographical than partisan in Congress. And what happens in Congress when the majority of constituency nationally looks like it's looking for an opening?
Well, there is the constituency. And then there's a constituency. It really depends on how you look at it. The same question about whether you favor lifting the embargo, said in a different way upon a movement toward human rights, then you get a different kind of answer. Or knowing that Cuba does not have any democracy at all, do you think that we should reward them with the lifting of the embargo? Then you get a different answer. You know, survey questions are very difficult to really calculate. What does show is election day. Who gets elected in South Florida? You know, when the folks who are hardline get elected, then people say, "But look at this survey. Look at these shiny keys."
Well,
and if you don't have the elected, I mean, it just depends. You can twist it around. What I say is, this is a vote on principle. We're not going to tell the Republicans to vote a certain way. We don't tell Democrats to vote a certain way. We have broad bipartisan support. In the South Florida congressional delegation, you couldn't ask for a more cohesive group. Federico Wilson, Alcee Hastings, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, all of us in a bipartisan manner are supporting freedom fighters in Cuba and not the regime.
Might be a good point to say right here, all of them were invited to join us this morning and we're not able.
Well, we're all far flung. This is our August, not our recess, work period.
All right. Congresswoman, I just need to get you on the record here. If the Obama approach is the wrong one, and we know what Helen Burton says, it lays out all the conditions under which the embargo would be lifted and there would be a normalization. But that's not going to happen either. I mean, so is there some other alternative way other than the way the President Obama is trying to?
Well, we wish that successive administrations, Republicans and Democrats, would have joined in the international call to sanction the Castro regime, just as we did against the horrible apartheid regime in South Africa of apartheid, just as we did when we had military juntas in Haiti, just as we've done with Iran for so many years. Now the U.S. is stepping back, lifting sanctions on Iran, led by the President and Secretary of State Kerry. It's the wrong approach in Iran. It's the wrong approach to Cuba. Let's get international solidarity.
Ileana, before we run out of time, excuse me, Glenna, let me get in a question that really, I think, matters to everybody in South Florida, and that is wet foot, dry foot, and the Cuban Adjustment Act. Two countries now have diplomatic relations. How can we have a migration policy that says, okay, if you're a Cuban national picked up at sea, we take you back. If you reach dry land, you're in free. 1 year and a day, and you're a legal resident, you become a citizen in 5 years. Does that make sense anymore?
It doesn't make sense, but I don't think that Congress is going to address it in this session, very little time that we have left. But you're right. You know, first of all, this wet foot, dry foot policy has always been so cruel because we're playing lottery and roulettes with people's lives. Yeah. If you happen to touch here, this glass, you stay. But if you're here in the plastic, you can't stay. It's crazy, and many people have died. Yes, and the Cuban Adjustment Act, out of all the refugees in the world, only Cubans have this granted to them. I would hope that we would see that a lot of refugees are deserving of this if you're going to have it for the Cubans. But I don't think that we're going to change that. I hope that we can keep some semblance of the Cuban Adjustment Act because discrimination does take place and persecution does take place in Cuba. I disagree with the president. Not everything is rosy there.
Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen,
thank you.
So good to see you.
Always
Sunday
great
morning.
to have you.
Thank you, guys. Have a great Sunday.
Thank you very much.
And up next, a different perspective on the U.S. Embassy opening in Havana from an involved Cuban-American leader who's changed his mind and a Cuban-American attorney who was at Friday's ceremony. Stay with us.
Half a century ago, Cuban-American immigrants spoke basically with one voice in fierce opposition to the Castro government and its embrace of communism.
A much different case today, and some of those early arrivals have recalculated their perspectives and are actually taking an active role in the debate. And one of those people is Raul Valdez-Fauli, a lawyer from Coral Gables, where he served as mayor from 1993 to 2001. He's very active in numerous civic and cultural organizations.
And Steve Zak is a Miami attorney who was born in Cuba and who attended Friday's embassy opening in Havana at the invitation of Secretary of State Kerry. He is a former president of the American Bar Association. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning. Great to have you come.
Morning.
Well, you heard the Congresswoman talk just a little while ago. Steve Zak, really want to get an impression. We all watched on television from here. It was a really interesting moment on many levels, but was there a palpable missing of dissidents at that ceremony from those who were there?
I think there were considerations that were taken into account by the embassy in their invitation list, but they were at the later event at the ambassador's home, so they were clearly spoken to. And if I was a dissident, I'd feel better today seeing a flag over the American embassy in Cuba than I would the day before when no flag was there.
Raul Valdez-Fauli, great to have you here. Tell us how your views on U.S.-Cuba relations have evolved over the years, and where are you now?
Right. I am a Cuban refugee. I mean, the definition. I came here when I was 17 years old, many, many years ago, and in 1960. And my views, I'm very definitely, and I'm still pro-democracy in Cuba, anti-dictatorship in Cuba, but several things have happened. I mean, the definition of insanity is to expect things to change when you keep doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. And we have been having the embargo for 55 years, and nothing has changed. He's still there. Secondly, in 2000, my father, who was 80-something at the time, and a great admirer of Ileana, by the way, he passed away 12 years ago. He was in his 80s. He decided to take his family, his grandchildren to Cuba to show them what he was about, what Cuba was about. These kids had been born in Boston and everywhere, Miami, New York, etc. And he took his grandchildren. It was a very emotional trip, and it convinced my father, us, I didn't go, I was in politics at the time, that we are Cubans at heart. I mean, we are part of the Cuban nation, and why should we give it up? I mean, the embargo, if that had worked, then okay, then maybe it will work. But after 55 years, I don't want to give up my nationhood, my soul, my heart. And that's, number one, doing something different. And number two, I don't want to be imposed by Congress or by the United States or by some mythical thing that will work in, trying to...
It should be Cubans who
resolve the Cuban issue.
And I think that was the main message that Kerry gave over and over again, that if we talk about what happened and what didn't happen, the only thing that really happened is there was an opportunity that now exists that didn't exist. What didn't happen is we didn't change our values one iota. We still believe in self-determination. We still believe in the rights of the dissidents, and we believe in human rights and freedom of religion. Kerry reiterated that at the home of the ambassador after the ceremony. But when he spoke out, and remember, he spoke in Spanish and English in large measure, and he was speaking to the Cuban people that they have the ultimate decision now that we have reached out. And I had a lot of Cubans come up to me on the street as we walked around Old Havana.
And what did they ask you? What did they say?
You know what they said? A lot of them couldn't speak English, and I speak Spanish, of course, but they didn't know that. And they'd say, thank you, just thank you. And they would be wearing American flag T-shirts. There's a hope, as we say, an esperanza among everyone that this is going to make a difference. The one thing that is certain is no one knows whether it's going to make a difference.
But I think it will make a difference.
But you know, Raul, there's a quote that yesterday's history, today's a mystery, and tomorrow's an opportunity. And what we have now is an opportunity. I think Ileana's correct in a lot of things she says. You know, she says, well, it's up to the Cubans to change. Somebody says it's up to the Americans to change. It's, you know, everyone's waiting for the next step. But the truth is, we're going to see who takes the next step and who's going to meet that step with another step and see where this opportunity leads us.
But I think it will make a difference. And yes, human rights are extremely important. There's no question about it. But we didn't have human rights with the embargo. We didn't have human rights before. Let's give this an opportunity. And after 55 years of not having human rights and having the embargo and not working, it's been 6 months since the opening, since December 17th. 6 months, let's give it a chance. And if it doesn't work, we'll go back to not having human rights, so we have no downside in this.
But I think you would agree that the one thing we should do is tell people to go and see for themselves.
Absolutely.
Well,
You know,
at the
that
moment, not
changes.
everyone can.
And they will get very depressed when they go.
Glenna, you say not everybody can. There's virtually no university, no religious group that isn't taking missions over
Well, you
to
can't
Cuba.
go to, you can't go to Varadero, sit on the beach, and drink a mojito.
Point being, sometimes you have to be disingenuous
explore,
to go.
You can go study, you can go visit and do things. Religious groups, educational groups, reporters, everybody.
Let me ask you a question. You signed off on a letter with various other people. That was before December 17th? Or
That was before December 17th.
So nobody really knew what December 17th announcement was coming.
Nobody knew the December 17th. And when I went to Cuba the first time, which
explain
was in
what that
2011,
letter was in case people...
The letter was trying to, advocating change, advocating a change in policy, advocating the lifting of the sanctions, advocating opening our dialogue, our communication with Cuba to see if we could change things. Because what had happened in the past, the embargo had not worked.
And you know what I found so interesting about that letter and so much of what's going on now is that people, such as yourself, who might have had those views, who might have even worked to further an opening, never really talked about it because the backlash, especially in South Florida, was so great and so emotional.
And you
But
know,
that's
an interesting
changed
thing
a
about that
lot.
letter that you're talking about is that the people who signed that letter, mostly, as opposed to the first letter, mostly are people that lost everything they had in Cuba.
Yes.
People that lost substantial properties, we lost a bank, signed that letter advocating change.
But there's a generational difference. Our family lost everything. I went to my home in Cuba this time.
And it's been changed, you told me.
It's a bank office right now. And they let us go in. I wish I'd never gone in because the memories were much better than what I saw they had done to the home. I'm glad my mother's 86.
That's an interesting lesson to throw out there.
It really is. My mother's 86, and you know, she has a tremendous amount of pain as people who came over here and lost everything. I was 13 years old, but I've watched my generation when we came here. There was a lot of discrimination, and there's a different Miami today, but there's also a different Cuban-American Miami today. There are many Cuban-Americans born in the United States. You know, anybody 50 years or younger born in the United States, and I think they have not all of them, but there's a significant group who are willing to, as Raul pointed out, not do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result.
All right. Raul, in mid-September, there are going to be some substantive talks, according to Secretary Kerry, and Cuba's Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez says, bring it on. We're ready to talk, including about human rights. I mean, do you have any kind of genuine hope that this is going to produce something?
I do have genuine hope that something will happen, not necessarily in September, but that there will be change.
Over a matter of months, maybe
Over a
even
matter
years.
of months, a matter of years maybe, but not 55 years of embargo, bloqueo, as they say. I have genuine hope that dialogue will work and has worked every time. And Vietnam, they say that they have a dictatorship and whatever it is, but Cuba has 1 million wealthy, successful entrepreneurs 90 miles away from Cuba. Vietnam doesn't. And I think that Cuba has 1 million people involved in what's happening in Cuba today that will make a difference in Cuba. And I think that's very important.
It has to
very,
change.
very important.
It has to change. But when I was reflecting on what was going on and the differences of viewpoint, I was thinking about a family who hadn't talked to each other for 50 years. Think about that. We're not going to see things the same way. We're going to have differences of opinion. It's going to take time.
Well,
but we have to take
what
the
I
first step.
refuse to do, when you're talking about the family, I refuse to deny my children. My eldest son is 48. He was born in Boston, and my grandchildren the opportunity to be Cuban, to visit Cuba and to be Cuban and to be something that their grandfather was and that their father is very proud of being. And we are denying them that opportunity, and I think that this opening will give them the opportunity to be Cuban.
I think that's a beautiful point in which to end. Raul Valdez-Fale, thank you very much.
Thank
Good
you.
luck with your mayoral campaign to come. Steve Zach, great to see you. Thanks very much.
Again.
And coming up next, our Powerhouse Roundtable. Stay with us. This morning, we are sad to report that Julian Bond has died. The civil rights activist and longtime board chair of the NAACP passed away last night in Fort Walton Beach. Bond was born in Nashville. He became an icon of the 1960s civil rights movement. He was on the front lines of the protests that led to the nation's landmark civil rights laws. Julian Bond was 75 years old.
And he was an intelligent and elegant man. I was
Yes.
privileged to interview him a couple of times. All right, well, we can talk about that, among other things, with our roundtable, where we take some of the best and brightest in South Florida to analyze and opine on the week's top stories.
And we've got an all-star cast this week. Michael Mayo, the columnist for the Sun-Sentinel, who takes on a variety of topics and issues, as only he can. Rosemary O'Hara is the editorial page editor of the Sun-Sentinel, and that page blistered Donald Trump this week for his misogynistic remarks. H.T. Smith is a respected Miami attorney and a civil rights leader who, we're glad to say, is becoming a roundtable regular. And with that build-up, you have a lot to live up to today, everybody.
Welcome. Great to have you come in. If we can, just momentarily, or not momentarily, but H.T., you certainly met Julian Bond, may have interacted with him when you led the civil rights movement here after Nelson Mandela was snubbed. He really was a remarkable guy.
He was a remarkable guy. He was a part of the intelligence of the civil rights movement. I got a chance to meet him at Florida A&M University, and he lit the campus up on fire. He was a person who I think could appeal to all segments of our society, and he would have been a congressperson had he not run against the one person in the world that he could not beat, and that was the great John Lewis, who also was respected more because of what happened to him as a result of his leadership.
Yeah, he was, of course, beaten on the bridge.
Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Julian Bond, didn't he host Saturday Night Live one time in
He
the
did.
1970s?
He did?
That's
You're
my
right.
generation remembers him like, he was pretty cool when he hosted Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
Too,
That was before Clinton played the sax
Yes,
on
it was.
TV.
Rosemary O'Hara, here we have just heard, I think, some thoughtful people talking about Cuba, and you remarked as you were sitting down, gee, we have a past and possible future mayor of Coral Gables who is talking about rapprochement with Cuba, and it's fine with him, and it's what his grandchildren deserve. I mean, this seems to be a sea change, doesn't it?
Right, the sands are absolutely shifting. Yes, to see the potential next mayor of Coral Gables take a position that is opposite what today's mayor has, to hear Ileana talk about ending wet foot, dry foot, that's a new thing. And to see when this American flag was raised over the embassy in Cuba, to see on Cuban television people criticizing their government, it is hopefully going to be this trickle thing that changes where we are today.
And I don't know if she spoke about ending wet foot, dry foot, but she just clearly stated it's unfair and it's a double standard, and other refugees from other places that are oppressed maybe should get the same kind of treatment. And that's kind of a shift from just, it's astounding. I arrived in South Florida in 1989, and, I remember back then, anytime anybody came from Cuba who was any way associated with the Castro regime would draw huge protests. Remember Los Van Van and all that stuff.
Sure.
And,
Yes,
and
sure.
now it's such a different atmosphere now, and I think it is just kind of a generational shift as time has gone on. Everybody realizes it is time for something new and for change.
Is that also a function of we're just becoming a more global society? I think people are accepting of different cultures and different governments, maybe not agreeing with them, but certainly have that more cultural affinity to people that they're closer to now?
And there are good arguments on both sides of this issue. The one thing they all agree upon is that they want to help to make a better life for the Cubans on the island. And yesterday I saw Cubans on the island laughing, dancing, singing, and waving the American flag, and they are hopeful. Hope is the fuel that will provide for progress. And so as far as the Cuban people are concerned, the verdict is very, very positive. Now there's an opportunity for change, and it requires both Cubans and Americans to take steps to make those changes. It won't be 54 days, it won't be 54 weeks, but hopefully it won't be 54 years.
Well, sitting together at the table, as they're going to do starting in September, well, they've done it for 6 months to get to this point, but Rosemary, in a sense, it's always better to talk than not to talk.
Absolutely, and already, and there are some things we think will be easier to talk about, maritime issues, hurricane preparedness. The issues of human rights are going to be harder, are where the debates and real tensions remain. This didn't solve everything on Friday, but it is the beginning of the beginning, and that was well said.
You had, in an editorial in the Sun Sentinel, you made a very interesting point that if the U.S. waits until human rights are restored in Cuba before making any progress, you would have to take that argument to Russia and China and break relations with those countries too. That was a very interesting comparison.
I'm picking up on that point. I mean, obviously one of the big things that's been harped on this week by the opponents to this new policy is, oh, the dissidents, where were they? They weren't invited to the ceremony. And my response is, well, how many dissidents did you see featured at the opening ceremonies of the Olympics in Beijing? So, I don't think it's necessarily the time or the place that you're going to be bringing in dissidents to kind of throw it in the Castro regime's face. Again, it's a step, and dissidents are going to play their role, which is to foment and agitate for change, and hopefully there'll come the day where they could express themselves freely and where people could vote in democratic elections.
All right, so a beginning of a beginning. Now, let's kind of go local if we can. Think global, act local, whatever the phrase is. I want to move on to Uber in Broward County, which I find a fascinating topic. Michael Mayo, you have columnized about this several times. I was at the Broward County Commission this past week, where 6 commissioners said, okay, we've got to solve this problem. Is it going to be solved?
Well, as Stacy Ritter, commissioner, said, I've been Ubered, and that means she got bludgeoned by constituents and emails and just phone calls.
It's become a verb.
Yeah, and basically they tried to set up one set of rules which allowed them to operate without restrictions on unregulated fares, no caps on the number of drivers, and that wasn't good enough for Uber. They didn't like some of the other restrictions with licensing and background checks.
Well,
and the
they
insurance
are an arrogant, in-your-face organization. They don't come in and ask permission. They simply say, we're here, we're operating, get used to it. And
now the commission is completely caved. It's a complete and utter capitulation.
But they didn't cave to Uber. I mean, this was a storming of the Bastille. This was the people speaking.
Right.
I want my ride sharing.
Right. Yeah, no, the people have spoken and they want their representatives to listen. And the reality is, I don't know if it's complete capitulation. There still will be some regulations, but you're right. But that said, on the other hand, the rules that the commission passed were really tough. To require part-time drivers to buy commercial insurance, they were
But what
over
is
the
state
top.
law? Are you allowed, if you have a personal vehicle, if you check your policy, you're not allowed to use it for hire purposes. So they just want, we need a clarification of what state law is, and then the insurance industry needs to come up with appropriate new
The
products.
Uber representative did say, we believe our universal policy will cover our part-time drivers,
and
but
meet
they're working
state
on,
law.
and meet the requirements of state law, which they must do.
But this is the way an open democratic society is supposed to work. The people basically said to the commission, you came up with an excellent solution looking for a problem. We, the people, don't have a problem with Uber. You do.
Right. Yeah.
Fix it.
Yeah, well, and they say now they will, and I heard Stacey Ritter say, I've been Ubered, and I think they've all been Ubered. All right, stay with us. We've got our roundtable going, and we're going to come back and talk about redistricting, among other things. Stay with us. Live in our studio on this Sunday morning, we are talking with the roundtable, and that is H.T. Smith, distinguished Miami attorney. That's not an oxymoron, I don't think. Rosemary O'Hara of the Sun-Sentinel, and Michael Mayo, columnist for the Sun-Sentinel.
An ethical journalist. That might be an oxymoron.
Ethical. Well,
Well, I was in military intelligence. That is an oxymoron.
I think that's our next topic. Oxymorons on the roundtable.
Yeah, Rosemary O'Hara, this week, your page, and I suspect maybe the author is sitting next to me, wrote a blistering and, I thought, brilliant editorial taking Donald Trump to task for his, I mean, misogynistic doesn't even begin to describe really what he has said over time about women, and of course what he has said recently about Megyn Kelly
Right.
on Fox.
Right. You know, 54% of the electorate is women. In the last election, 55% of women went for Obama. If the Republicans want to win, they have got to deal with what the Democrats have framed as the war on women, especially in a year when the candidate for the Democrats is likely to be a woman. And what have we heard so far? Rubio would rather let a woman die than have an abortion. Jeb Bush,
After a rape.
Jeb Bush would rather, or says, though he dialed it back, would, says too much money on health care. And Donald Trump calls women slobs and fat pigs and judges them on their appearance. And so Megyn Kelly was right on to ask this question about how he treats women. And in the dust-up of all that, we discover that Trump's top spokesman is from Fort Lauderdale, this political consultant who regularly calls women the C word and words that can't be said in front of your audience. If the Republicans want to win, they better increase theirs. Well, first off, you can judge a man by who he surrounds himself. And in this case, Trump showed poor judgment.
You don't even want to say Roger Stone's name, is that it?
Who was
Really,
either
I
fired or
don't.
quit, depending on who you ask.
And he's kind of a
He's
real
a dirty
political
trickster
character.
who prides himself on being a dirty trickster.
He does.
And that's his top spokesman?
All right, so I want to hear a man's point of view because women write about this topic all the time, and frankly, it's something that women in general face in society, maybe not to that level, but on a daily basis. H.T. Smith, a man's point of view.
Yeah, I think men are even tough on issues like this. And I asked a friend of mine who handles animals down in the Redlands area after the Megyn Kelly statement that insinuated he was talking about her menstruation. And he says, Donald Trump is spewing skunks scent on the Republican brand, and if it gets into the fabric, you can't get the stink out. And I think that that is what is happening. You cannot have these kinds of just despicable comments about women, our mothers, our wives, our girlfriends, our daughters. Those are the people that really support men, but this won't work.
But nothing he's saying or doing is sinking him. And what does that say about the, Republican primary voters, that he keeps leading all these polls, and then Iowa now his lead is even, wider than before the debate? I don't know what it says.
I think the reason is that there are 17 people in the race. He's polling at 20%. He appeals to the low information voter. As the number shrinks, that he's going to have to draw more than 20%, and I don't see that number growing.
Well, he has certainly tapped into, I think, the country's discussed anger over gridlock in Washington and politicians who are squishy and unequivocal. I mean, he speaks his mind, and often what he speaks is ugly and sexist and unpleasant.
And when people start thinking about the problems facing them in their daily lives, they're going to see that Donald Trump does not have an answer at all for them, and that's when you'll start seeing him sink.
But I think his rise, it signals a little bit of trouble for the Democrats and for Hillary Clinton in particular, because there is this anti-establishment wave going on. And Hillary now, with her continued problems with her email gate, or whatever you want to call it, she doesn't come off as trustworthy. She comes off as the typical evasive, do anything, say anything politician. And if she is the de facto nominee, I don't know. I think the Democrats might be in trouble with whoever ends up being the opponent. The problem is, I think, do the Democrats have a savior? And it's not going to be Joe Biden. And, but somebody that's like a Trump, an politician to come in, and the name that's been floated is the Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, who might be maybe a more progressive version of the successful business prototype.
If he's going to get in, the train is leaving the station in terms of presidential campaigns. Before we run out of time, and I wish we wouldn't, because this is great, there is nobody is really paying much attention, including lawmakers, but in Tallahassee, the state legislature is meeting, and Rosemary, you've got a column editorial in today's paper about the redistricting of congressional districts in South Florida. Representative Ted Deutsch and Representative Lois Frankel have been put into the same district, and they're redrawing that. What's wrong with the plan that they've got?
There is, the word redistricting makes people's eyes glaze over, but there is nothing more important in our politics that explains why we are so divided today than how the map makers can draw lines that will divide a Republican husband from a Democratic woman in the same house. Those decisions, those lines are being drawn this week in Tallahassee, and voters passed fair districts to say, let's make them make sense. In our area, between Palm Beach and Broward counties, the proposal is mostly to make Broward one district and Palm Beach mostly one district, yet our political and business leaders continue to want to have these vertical districts that divide us east and west. And it's about incumbent protection, not about communities that make sense and that would improve our politics.
Right, we need communities of interest together. And I think that is what fair districts are intended to do. And we have to insist, the media and the public, that they have fair districts that keep communities together, not politicians in office.
Which requires everyone's eyes not to glaze over.
Not amigo, as William Sapphire used to call it. Mine eyes glaze over. But they didn't for this discussion. Thank you all. Terrific. Thanks very much. After the break, questions surrounding a retired Miami-Dade corrections sergeant who was shot and killed by law enforcement. We will take a closer look when we get back. Questions are being raised about the circumstances in which a retired Miami-Dade corrections sergeant was shot and killed by law enforcement near Gainesville last month.
And those who knew Earl Jackson find it hard to believe reports that he claimed ties to ISIS.
He loved serving and he loved doing different things for the church.
Just knowing Earl just doesn't make any sense.
From his block to his church, where hundreds attended his funeral last weekend.
The Earl that I know would do nothing like this.
To the courthouse, the Miami-Dade Corrections Sergeant patrolled 26 years. Every person we asked about Earl Jackson had something to say like this.
Very humble, compassionate, hardworking.
Earl was about taking care of family, doing things, doing his catering.
Jackson was shot and killed 2 weekends ago at the end of a 5-hour manhunt in the woods off I-75 near Gainesville. That much is fact. What stuns those who know him is the lack of information about that and the official account from Alachua County sheriffs that he was stopped on the shoulder, fired at deputies. Law enforcement converged, shut the highway, and hunted him for 5 hours. And they say at the end, he said this.
When deputies confronted him in the woods, he made some statements and called out the name ISIS.
ISIS, terror ties they claim to have heard, and then checked Jackson and his car for explosives.
And where do you get this ISIS stuff from? It was crazy.
No, I can't even fathom that.
To those who know Jackson, the official story, the lack of news, sounds like a cover-up, their words, and their perspectives.
Especially with all the various things that's happening to black guys, you know, police shootings and all of these other things.
It's just scary, you know, being on the road by yourself or whatever, it's just scary. You know, anyone can cover up anything.
Deputies involved do not wear body cameras there in North Florida. There may be dash cam video, but what that may show, we don't yet know.
The FDLE is the lead investigating agency into Jackson's shooting, and they will only say it is an open investigation.
Still to come today, stars, stripes, and symbolism. Raising the flag in Havana brings it home for those who may have no personal stake in Cuba relations. That's next.
Let's take a live look now from our Mount Sinai Medical Center cam, and it looks kind of nice out there.
It does, and let's check in with Weather Authority meteorologist Trent Eric with the Sunday forecast.
Today across South Florida, we're going to see sun, clouds, and rain showers on and off anytime throughout the day. And you can see that southeast breeze pushing the moisture from the Bahamas right towards Dade, Broward, and the Florida Keys. With some sunshine peeking through, it's definitely humid. It'll send our temperatures up to about 91. So late afternoon or early evening beach plans, surf just a foot or so there in the afternoon. Tomorrow, as we start Monday, 30% chance of a shower or storm, so slightly drier. And then the extended forecast keeps that chance of rain every day in the afternoon.
Thanks, Trent. In all the post-flag-raising debate Friday over new U.S.-Cuba relations, a friend at dinner said something that made me stop and think. He said, the only people with the right to weigh in on the process are Cubans, Cuban exiles, Cuban-Americans here and there. Incidentally, he is not Cuban. And in a way, he has a point, and one that anyone who has ever been the victim of anything can understand. Those who have had lives upended and loved ones hurt or killed, rights trampled, properties taken, however much time has passed, those are the people to whom justice has to make sense. But the American flag rising on that property Friday evoked visceral reactions in many people who seemingly have no personal stake in what goes on between countries. The stars and stripes raised anywhere can be a symbol of progress, of hope, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, where some really do see a white flag of surrender by the Obama administration. We've heard that. Many more Americans see the possibility that an open door shines more light than a closed one. For all the unilateral changes and concessions the U.S. has made, and lack thereof on the part of the Cuban government, a significant change Friday may not have been so obvious. Cuban television, which is government-run, broadcast Secretary of State Kerry's speech live, in full, unedited, for Cuban citizens to watch and to hear. And Mr. Kerry went there. He all but called for genuine democracy, quote, where people are free to choose their leaders, express their ideas, practice their faith, unquote, and respect international norms of human rights. The Cuban people got to hear that and to hear their own leader's response as well. And that is the part of the debate that gives every American a stake in Cuba-U.S. relations. There are others, to be sure, but this week it was all about the literal and symbolic raising of the American flag. So, what do you think? We invite you to weigh in on any topic you like. Email, Facebook, Twitter. It all works.
Un nuevo dia. We'd love to hear from you. Remember, stay informed, get involved. We will see you next week.